Today we're talking about when is the best time to start college prep. I'm sure that if you're listening to this, you probably live in an area where it seems like every year students are getting started earlier and earlier. There are a number of cities worldwide where students will routinely get started in late elementary and early middle school for college prep. So basically, what we're trying to break down today is when should you actually do it? Is earlier always better? Is there a limit to that? And what you should be considering as a family as you make this decision? In order to understand when the best time is to start college prep, you actually need to understand what drives admissions decisions from a very high level. Now, this is a significant oversimplification, but I do think it captures maybe 70 to 80% of what motivates admissions decisions. For most families, they are bombarded with messages around how complicated the admissions process is, right? You need to have perfect grades, perfect test scores. You need to be captain of this. You need to play the cello or the piano or the violin. You need to do this summer program. You need to take these AP classes, class president of various school clubs. You need to do community service, et cetera, et cetera. And the good news is that this sort of litany of variables is actually largely wrong. So actually 70 to 80% of how admissions decisions are made can actually be boiled down to just two primary variables. The first one is, are you academically qualified? Do you have the right grades and test scores, APs, et cetera? Most families are familiar with this already. However, what people don't understand is that this particular variable, academic qualifications, is really a binary variable. You either are or you are not academically qualified. Another way of putting that is to say that for every school, there is a level at which getting higher grades and higher test scores no longer improves your chances of being admitted. So a simple example of this would be if you have a 1550 on the SAT, there really is not a school in the United States where getting a 1580 is going to meaningfully improve your probability of success. Not even really at MIT, which would be MIT and Caltech would be the only schools where that is even plausible. It's very important because what a lot of students will do is they'll have a 3.95 GPA or a 1520 on the SAT, and they'll just invest all of their time trying to eke out every additional point on their GPA or on their test scores when actually they're already past the sort of qualifications threshold. There's a longer conversation that I'll probably record separately, which is understanding what is that threshold. And the answer is it's a little more complicated than we would like. It depends on the high school that you're applying from and the university that you're applying to. The important point here is you do not need to have perfect grades and test scores. They're not even necessarily desirable. There's over 2,000 students just in the US applying to college every year that have both perfect grades and perfect test scores, which is more than the freshman class at any Ivy League or Ivy Plus school. If they wanted students with those qualifications, they could literally fill their entire freshman class with them, but they don't. And the reason why is because those students do not appear more impressive to them in terms of their academic qualifications than students who are a bit lower. And those students who are a bit lower maybe have a better extracurricular profile. So that's variable one. Are you academically qualified? The second variable is, there's a lot of different ways of saying it. Some people call it a hook, a spike. I like to refer to, we call it an application persona in Genius, but I like to refer to it as is, are you an expert at something? Have you identified a passion or interest? Something that is, let's call it plausibly related to what schools teach. Video gaming, not so much, although these days there's room for that. But like entrepreneurship, most undergraduate programs, you don't have an entrepreneurship class or an entrepreneurship major, but it's still plausibly related to what schools teach. So do they have a particular area of interest or passion that they have developed further than other applicants? So the best predictor of whether or not a student will get into a great school is you can get their application. You look at their transcript. So you're basically answering the question, are you academically qualified? Look at their test score. Then you go to their activities list and you say, is this the most advanced student applying this year with this particular interest? If the answer is yes, they'll do very well at the most elite schools. And if the answer is no, they won't. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't get into great schools. I'm just talking about through the perspective of the most elite colleges. So those are the two variables. So knowing that, when is the right time to actually start college prep? Like at what point do you say this is too early? So I'll give a preliminary answer and then I'll explain. In general, earlier is better up until a point. I think that if you're doing things in 6th and 7th grade that are ostensibly college related, it's too early. That doesn't mean you can't start other valuable forms of preparation in 6th and 7th grade, things that are related to like soft skill development, educational development, enrichment activities, interest exploration. You can, but it's not really college prep at that age. terms of the perspective of what will produce overall the best outcome, ignoring the additional cost of starting earlier, but what would produce the best outcome? The answer is that earlier is almost certainly better, meaning like 7th and 8th grade, 9th grade, et cetera. That will produce the best outcome overall. Obviously, as you work for multiple years doing college prep, if you're hiring a consultancy, it also gets more expensive. That's just an idealized world, right? Cost is no issue when you start. I'll talk in a bit about what's the realistic time for families that don't want to spend a fortune doing college prep. What is the realistic time where they can get the best return on their investment? We'll talk about that in a second. So first, I just want to talk a little bit about why starting early is so valuable. So we have plenty of families that start work with us in middle school. That's totally common and super effective if it's done correctly. But why is it so valuable? Because you're not really doing college prep in 7th and 8th grade. That is like the extracurricular activities that you participate in 7th and 8th grade are probably not making it onto your college application. So why do we even care? There are several things that are important. So the first is, in terms of academic qualifications, usually the best way to just lift the tide of a student's academic qualifications in high school is to work on certain kinds of soft skill development in middle school. So that would be advanced writing courses, extremely useful for students, especially students who are more STEM oriented and will more likely to get bad grades in history and English classes. Public speaking, important because you want students who are able to participate in class and feel comfortable doing so. Teachers confuse high levels of eloquence for high levels of understanding, but it's still useful. And then basic executive functioning and organizational skills, extremely important. The vast majority of students who do extremely well in high school, some proportion are just truly intellectually gifted, but even then, they'll do unbelievably well in certain subjects and fairly poorly in others. But the vast majority of students who are very consistent in terms of their performance are students who have really good organizational skills and executive functioning skills. They know how to allocate their time. They know how to organize themselves. They know how to be disciplined in the things that they're doing, how much they study for tests, when they start studying, when they finish a paper. So all of that stuff is best done in middle school if possible, so that you start high school with sort of this enhanced skill set. Probably the most likely culprit is social media. I'm not an expert on why this would be. Just anecdotally, what we see pretty much worldwide is that every year students' executive functioning goes down. And that's a real problem, not just for their ability to succeed in high school, but their ability to succeed in college, their ability to succeed in a career, et cetera. In the near future, people will think about executive functioning training the way that we think about tutoring and test prep now. It's a luxury, but it's a luxury that if you can afford it, you should definitely invest in it because it's extremely high returns in terms of a student's ultimate success in life and in higher ed. So that's the academic component of it. Like you can take advanced classes while you're in middle school. You don't have to. I guess you could tutor for subjects in middle school. You don't have to. Your grades in middle school do not matter for college admissions. Those things can happen. A lot of families will try to get their kids into higher level math and things like that. Again, that's fine. Is it going to make a huge difference on the application? No. Do I think of that as being necessary? No, but it can be helpful. The other thing that's really valuable from starting early is going back to what drives admissions decisions, right? The sort of academic qualifications and like being an expert. If you look at really elite schools, like at Harvard, during the lawsuit with Students for Fair Admission, one of the things that came out was that they estimate that about 80% of applicants to Harvard are academically qualified, and only 1 in 15 students are actually getting admitted. Among other things, what that tells us is that our second variable, whether you're an expert at something, is actually doing most of the heavy lifting in terms of whether you get admitted. You can also think about it as grades and test scores are necessary to get in, but not sufficient. Really, this sort of extracurricular or particular expertise that you have that drives the bulk of admissions decisions, which I think is more true today than it's really ever been. Maybe with the exception of the peak of test optional policies and stuff like that. But the sort of extracurriculars are absolutely fundamental to the admissions process. So knowing that, knowing how important it is to be an expert at something, the question then is, are you able to become a greater expert at something if you can devote 5 years to it or 1 year? Which is a rhetorical question because obviously the answer is 5 years. The earlier that you identify your interests, and the earlier that you can start contributing to them through extracurricular engagement, the more your accomplishments will build on one another. The farther you can go, the deeper you can go, et cetera, et cetera. And so that is fundamentally one of the reasons why when families talk to us, most families, they're really focused on the application. This is less true now than it was in the past, but it's still generally true. They think that most families assume that the real value here is helping you with the application. That is not the real value. And any company that tells you that it's the real value does not understand the admissions process. The truth of the matter is that an hour of my time or admissions experts' time in ninth grade is worth far more than an hour in 12th grade, because we can tell you in an hour in ninth grade all sorts of things that you need to do over the ensuing years that will make you a completely different caliber of applicant. Whereas in 12th grade, the truth is that on the applications, like, yes, there are some students can DIY and do it well. It's really hard. It's mostly just because it's a type of writing that students aren't familiar with and they don't know what admissions offices see a lot. So they tend to write things that are really common that they don't realize is super common, but just makes them blend in with the crowd. And they don't necessarily understand what the institutional priorities are of those schools. So their essays can be very well written, but usually aren't very effective on the DIY front, albeit I'm obviously biased, but just in terms of like how I think about this, yes, I will have my children work with an admissions essay specialist that is not myself or my wife. In terms of the application essays, the reality is that it's very valuable to get help, but there are a lot of people that can help. It's like SAT prep, right? There's like really good SAT prep companies, there's mediocre ones, and there's bad ones. In each of these categories, there's not a ton of differentiation, right? They all have the same promises in terms of how many points you'll go up. Their curriculum looks mostly the same. You have the perspective of an admissions officer, like literally a former admissions officer is working with you. As long as you have that and somebody who's a really talented writer, they can do a fine job. That's just a reality. The real value is what you do earlier, especially as things like your activities list and extracurricular accomplishments continue to govern most of the admission or a lot of the admissions decisions. In any event, the point is that starting earlier is much more effective in large part because you can identify your core passions or interests. You can develop them over time. Is obviously somebody asked you, is it better to invest $1 for 5 years or invest $1 for 1 year? Obviously, it's better to invest $1 for 5 years. And so that allows you to actually develop that expertise. It's another reason why it's really important not to just start like your most important extracurricular activities in 11th grade. You can't go that deep in just that time. There are other reasons too, in terms of how admissions officers look at people who cram activities into 11th grade. We established that starting earlier is better, but it's not true college prep. And anybody who says you just start preparing for college in middle school, it's just that's ridiculous. Like what you're doing in middle school is enrichment more than anything else. What you're doing in high school is college prep. Both super valuable. I encourage people to do both, but most people do not have the means to be paying for 6 years of college prep. College prep is expensive. Ingenious is expensive. All the other companies are expensive. Some of us are much more expensive than others. But the reality is that in college preparation work is so expensive because it is so individualized. So you're getting people's really good credentials. They're working with you one-on-one. All of the advice is tailored to the student or should be. You can't do a class-based kind of format. You can't have 15 kids in a class doing admissions consulting. That really does not work. Though I'm hopeful that it will in coming years. I think that would be important to getting more people access to these resources. But for the time being, it's not. And so the costs to the organizations are high, and therefore the prices are high. That's why college prep is expensive. Unlike standardized test prep, where you can get a curriculum that's one size fits all, and you can teach it in groups of 10, 20, 30 students at a time, the cost can be way lower. But if you look at the really good companies that focus on private tutoring, like one-to-one tutoring, they're just as expensive. You might not use the same number of hours, but they're charging $200 to $300 an hour. Some companies are charging $500 to $1,000 an hour. It's expensive. It is an investment and an important one. I'll talk maybe a minute at the end about how I think about this from a family's perspective. How do you think about the return on your investment? Is it worth it, et cetera? But first, I want to answer a more basic question, which is, okay, we know that the best time to start is super early, but realistically, when is the time where you're getting the most bang for your buck? When is the time that if you're going to do it, you should definitely do it? I would say that the answer is probably early in 10th grade. The reason why is that there's a very large difference between basically starting the key extracurricular activities that are related to your interests in 10th versus starting in an 11th. Colleges are looking for students who have a clear area of interest. They've been able to sustain their involvement in that interest over a long period of time. They basically want to know that if they admit you, you're going to go on and have some big impact on the world. And one of the best ways of predicting that is, have you chosen a specific area to focus on and then you already started having impact in it, right? A student who starts like doing zoological research in ninth grade, I probably should have chosen a different field, but here we are. Zoological research in like ninth grade and has been working at it and doing research ever since versus the student who starts it in 11th grade. The answer is the student who started in the ninth grade is way more likely both to stick with it in the long term, and sticking with it is important to ultimately having a major impact. So the longevity of your involvement is important. And there's a huge difference just in terms statistically, in terms of your probability of success in the admissions process if you started your major extracurricular activities in 10th versus 11th. So one way that I can demonstrate this is from our own sort of student outcomes. So the way that we talk about outcomes, I think mostly online, but certainly internally, the way that we think about the quality of our service and the outcomes is how much more likely are you to succeed if you work with us versus if you don't. Now, this metric, which I think we were the first to start using, mostly because I felt like the way that companies were representing outcomes in terms of just raw numbers of students getting into elite schools didn't tell us anything because we didn't know how many students they worked with or what the qualifications of their students were when they started working with the company. So it could have been that the company had no value, or it could be that their actual 100 Ivy League admits sounds great as long as you aren't working with 10,000 students. So I didn't like that. So we started this sort of concept of like, how much higher is your probability? A lot of companies have really bastardized this, which is really unfortunate because it's probably the closest that families can get to actually measuring the return on their investment. Just as an aside, the way that companies do this, some just lie, which is kind of unfortunately a reality in this industry. If numbers are outrageously high, I'd be suspicious. It's never those companies that have the best service. Then other companies, what they'll do is they'll look at just a specific population of students, but not their like global population. They'll look at students who are like prep schools in Manhattan and where they're going to school and claim, okay, we're like 5-10 times more likely to get into an Ivy League, when it's like, if you actually look at their student population, they're actually barely better than the general student population, meaning that they don't actually add value. To some extent, you'll have to believe me when I use these numbers, and we can obviously substantiate them and all of that. So average across all of our students globally. So it's probably a little higher in the US. It's probably similar, a little lower internationally. But globally, all of our students are about 8 times as likely to get admitted to really top schools, so like top 10, top 20 Ivy League schools. And about 7 times as likely to get admitted to top 30 schools. Now, the way that we ascertain this is we literally buy application data from students that did not work with us. And then we compare students with comparable grades and test scores that didn't work with us to those that did. So we're trying to hold constant academic qualifications, right? So the average is 8 times. And so if you actually look at our 10th graders, the average of our 10th graders is 8 times. But if you go 1 year further, if you go to 11th grade, that drops down to about 4 times. So 4 times is still a huge difference, but you've literally lost half the efficacy in 1 year. And it drops off again a little bit for just the application. Versus if you go longer, if you look at 9th grade and 8th grade, now you're talking about 10 to 12 times the probability. But the greatest drop by far is between 10th and 11th. So just statistically, if our population of students is any representation, statistically, the place where you're getting the best return on your investment is probably 10th grade rather than 9th or 11th. But if what you're looking for is the absolute highest return, meaning just like the highest probability of success, starting in middle school or 9th grade is probably the answer. That's how I would think about it. The answer is college prep, if you're doing it with a good company, can pretty much always be worth it. Even just doing a little work on the application can double your probability of success. So it's always worth it. The place where you get the most value for every dollar that you spend is 10th grade. I'll caveat that by saying that the vast majority of the companies, they have not invested in the resources and the curriculum and IP necessary to provide real value earlier. So for most companies, what they're doing is they're charging you smaller amounts of money earlier on in the process. That's just to lock you in. You get a few meetings a year. They're generic. They don't add value. And then the real big sort of payment comes at the end. So you have to be sure that they have a lot of process in the early years. And one of the things that I tell families to do is look for what resources they have. Like they say you should do research with a professor. Do they have professors? Show me these professors that you work with. Prove it. Prove this isn't just one family friend who works at UMich. If they say you should start your own company or nonprofit, do they have people, entrepreneurs and residents on staff that can help you launch those? Because 99.99% of high schoolers cannot do that on their own. If they say they have internships, you ask where, and more than just asking where, you say, is the company aware of these internships? There was a really funny case recently. I won't mention any names, but there was a large company in this space that had been advertising very almost brazenly that they had this internship. I think it was at HSBC. And it turned out that it wasn't an internship at HSBC. HSBC knew nothing about it. And then one of the parents made them aware. And obviously HSBC freaked out. And I think the person probably lost their job. Real internships are going to be with smaller companies where you get to work directly with the senior leadership. So you're getting a lot more mentorship and you can actually have a tangible impact, which when you're in high school is a lot more important than the name brand of where you intern. You need to know that they have the resources to actually add value earlier. Otherwise, you're just paying extra money for like just mentorship. Right? And you can give great mentorship, but if you don't have the resources to execute on that mentorship, you're missing at least half the value. I would, generally speaking, as an aside, also be wary of any company where the cost for the application process is significantly higher than the cost for the work earlier in the process. The truth is that on the application process, the amount of hours that you spend on that is not wildly different from what you spend in 9th or 10th grade. In some cases, it's less. There is a finite amount of hours you can spend on an application before you're beating a dead horse. And so what that normally means is that they have a weak program earlier on that is really intended just to string families along for the application process. And that's just not good. The other thing you might ask is, what is the average length of a student's engagement with your company? The companies that are really good at the long-term planning, their length will be 2, 3, maybe even 4 years. Company that averages 12 to 18 months, that's probably a company that does the application. Maybe they're good at it, maybe they're not, but they're not relying on a lot of value being added earlier. They're relying on just value at the end. If you are just looking for the absolute best outcome, meaning the highest probability of success is early, it's 7th or 8th or 9th grade, that is better because you can develop your interests, you can develop your passions, your extracurricular activities, you can develop all the soft skills that are necessary to succeed in high school. It's also more expensive because you're starting earlier. So what is the time to start that has the best return on investment? The answer to that is 10th grade. There's a big difference between 10th and 11th grade in terms of the probability of success in college prep. But ultimately, good college prep, it should be valuable enough at each stage that you get the best return on investment at the end. Now, I promised earlier that I would talk about what is a return on investment for students and how I think about this for families. The majority of families that use college prep are getting little to no financial aid. So they're investing, let's call it $200,000 to $350,000 or more in a college education. So that's quite a lot. The first way of thinking about a return on investment is, would you rather pay that money to a tier 2 university or a tier 1 university? I don't necessarily ascribe to the concept that there are rigid tiers. Would you rather pay full tuition at NYU, which is a truly excellent school, or Harvard, which is Harvard? And what is that worth to you? What is that distinction worth to you? I think that's an important question, because if it's not worth it to you to add a whole bunch of additional cost on for the difference, then you shouldn't do it. And if your answer is, I would probably pay twice as much to be paying it to Harvard instead of NYU, then you're getting a good deal. That's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is, how much better are my children's outcomes after graduation? There is a meaningful difference, although it's more nuanced than people realize, between going to a less competitive college and a more competitive college in terms of what jobs you can get, what their average salaries are. So there's a part of this which is a return on investment, and it's actually money, where it's if you go to this elite school over the lifetime of your career, you're likely to earn whatever, $1 million, $2 million, $3 million more over the lifetime of your career. And so that's your return on investment. That's another way of thinking about it. It's a little bit overly utilitarian in my view, but I think that it is one way of considering. Another way of considering a return on investment is, will I get more scholarships? Am I more likely to get financial aid if I do this? The reality is that, let's say that you're qualified and en route, you're going to a really good state school, and you invest a bunch of money in order to qualify yourself to get into a really good private university, top 30 university, something like that. The reality is that those kinds of students are also the ones who get scholarships and more generous financial aid offers from the local public institution because they know that you're going to have other options. I went to high school in New Hampshire, but I lived in Vermont. It's a complicated story. But I applied to UVM, University of Vermont. And because they knew that I was going to get into other schools, I forget what the offer was, but it was almost full tuition, basically. So that's another way of thinking about ROI. You're more likely to get scholarships if you're more impressive on paper and you're good with the application materials. I think last year our students averaged $10,000 to $18,000 in scholarships. So another way of return on investment is thinking about it in terms of like literally getting discounts on your education. I don't think that families should bank on that, but that is one way of thinking about it. And then the last way of thinking about it is just in terms of probability maximization, right? Which is like, how much more likely am I to succeed doing this program versus not? And is that worth the cost? Again, it's hard in this industry. It's very hard to distinguish between good companies and bad companies, trustworthy companies and shady companies. And shady companies are a pretty significant population. That's the nature of the industry, is that a lot of the services are non-falsifiable. If you work with me and you get in, it's because of me. And if you get rejected, is it my fault? If you can't answer that, and I can't answer that, it creates a situation which there's a lot of people who are basically selling snake oil, right? Because you can't really verify what value that they're adding or not. And it makes it incredibly difficult to ascertain the good companies from the terrible ones because they sound very similar. And that applies to things like their outcomes, right? So a company says, okay, here's our outcomes, and you're 50 times as likely to get into MIT. My advice, and I think I said this on another podcast, my advice is ask them for the raw data. Tell me how many students you worked with. Tell me how many students got in, not just from one city, like globally, how many students got in, and then compare that to the overall acceptance rate. We have competitors who make these outlandish claims about their population of students getting in and how much higher that is than the average percentage, but they make the mistake of including on their website how many students they work with, which allows us to see that actually their results are barely better than just the average general applicant population. They're adding essentially little to no value. So you really can't tell, but that is one way of thinking about ROI. You do have to investigate. Like if you guys come to Ingenious and you're interested in services, that's great. I still encourage you to ask follow-up questions about that. It's important to be transparent about these things. And if a company can't be transparent about these things, there's a reason why. I hope that this was helpful. I'm sure that I'll do another one soon. If there's anything in particular you'd like to hear about, I'm happy to record. I think the next podcast I do will be with my wife, Dr. Emily Ulrich, on The Anxious Generation, which is a great book sitting somewhere behind me by Jonathan Haidt, talking a bit about that book and also how it influences our kind of parenting style. I hope you'll tune in then and have a wonderful day.